all I ever ask is that they listen. They listen to me, they listen to other people, they get all of the information they can and just keep their mind open to the possibility.
The alien abduction phenomenon is an area of ufology that is still considered too controversial to be worthy of serious investigation by many mainstream researchers. However, thousands of sane and rational people around the world continue to report bizarre encounters with small, non-human entities, seemingly defying any rational explanation. Today, I'm here to meet Anne and Paul Andrews, whose lives and those of their children have been affected for many years by otherworldly intelligence. So what are your earliest recollections of anything paranormal happening?
I suppose looking back on it, it would have to be when Jason was born, just after he was born. It was when we put him in his own room, in his own cot. He would be moved from his cot during the night. We would hear him crying. We'd go in there and find that, sometimes he was the other way up in the cot. Sometimes he was underneath it. A few times we found him under a chair, didn't we?
Yeah, or behind the door.
Or behind the door. He was always in the room, always crying, whenever anything like this happened. But we couldn't work out what was happening. I suppose it took us, wasn't till he was 12 that we actually started thinking, well, maybe there is something to this. It was really when we were watching a program on hypnosis, and as it went off the interval, there was this guy, and he said, I need to remember what happened because I was driving my lorry and there was this big flash of light and I lost 2 hours of time. And that's the point that Jason got up, threw something at the TV, and Paul said, what the hell do you think you're doing? And he was just crying his eyes out, wasn't he? And he just said that man on there is so stupid because he said he shouldn't want to remember. He said, because I remember everything. He said, and I don't want to remember. And that was the point. He rushed out to the kitchen and we were just sort of sitting there thinking, what the hell's going on?
I didn't know what to think.
Didn't know what to think.
Looked at each other and thought, what's going on?
And that's the point where Daniel just sort of looked at us and he said, don't you get it? We were like, what? And he said, he said, Jason's being abducted by aliens. We'd heard it before, as I said, he'd said the same thing since he was about 3. It was always the same thing. These small beings would come into his bedroom. They would come up through the floor, didn't they? They'd come through the window. And he said, they would make him float away with them. He'd float through the wall. And he always, when he was little, he always said they took him to a hospital place. And he said that he was always in this big room. He was unable to move. He could move his eyes. He could see what was going on, but he couldn't sort of move any other part of him.
Many visitors have commented on paranormal events that have occurred while visiting.
Very different. And she came in here and she suddenly became very ill. She couldn't breathe. She kept holding her throat. She said she felt she was being strangled. And we got her outside and she was very, very white. As soon as we got her outside the room, she sort of felt a little bit better. But she was quite ill for about 3 or 4 days. And that was just by coming in here. Yet other people come in here and they sort of drink in the energy and they love it. Because we find that when he gives talks, one of the main questions from people is, Jason, what do you think about, 2012, the Mayan calendar and, the end of everything? And his answer is, nothing is written in stone. The earth is changing. He said it's changing now. Basically, the planet is rebelling against all the things that we've done to her. And he said, but, you've got to remember that the planet is a living thing. Continents won't be the same. He said a lot of people will, he calls it expire, doesn't he? He said a lot of people will expire. For those of you that don't, you've got to decide how you continue in this existence. He says, no, he said 2012 is just another blip. He said, but he said it doesn't mean the end of everything. He said it just means change. We would find him missing from his cot. He would sometimes be underneath it. We would hear him cry in the night and go into his room and find that he was at the wrong end of the cot, where it was impossible for a month-old baby to to get to.
Mary Rodwell is a counsellor who deals with people who say they are the victims of alien abduction. She feels Jason's case is authentic.
It's absolutely classic abduction, right from the whole parameter of, Jason being born and, the finding, him as a baby outside the cot and not explaining it, where I hear that the same thing from other people saying, my son was not in the cot, and I couldn't work it out. A lot of very tangible physical things.
The unusual events happening to Jason were about to take a new and frightening turn. On the 2nd of July 1987, Jason's 4th birthday, the family would experience a visit they would never forget.
Jason had fallen asleep on the couch, and suddenly there was a real sort of heavy banging at the door. It's like really, really hard, not like just a normal knocking. It was like, somebody was kicking. And of course, my husband, he just jumped straight up, said, who's that, doing that to my door? And he just sort of flung the door open, and there was nobody there at all. And he looked up and down the lane, and there was nothing. He came back in, closed the door, and said to myself and my mum, well, that's odd, there's nobody there, but we'd all heard the knocking. Then there was a really sort of bright bolt of lightning. He just opened his mouth and just started spewing out all these fantastic numbers. It was just like a computer. This went on for a few minutes, and as he was talking the numbers, the banging began again. But this time it seemed to reverberate, sort of, it got louder and louder, and it seemed to be coming not just from the front door, but from the windows, the back of the house. Jason just seemed to get up from the couch, and he walked over towards the door. My husband restrained Jason, and he just literally looked up at my husband and just said, but I have to go, they're waiting for me. And the banging all the while was just going on. And it was just so strange. It was like, as soon as Jason started to blink, as if he was coming out of this trance-like state, he started to blink. And the more he came round, the more the banging receded. The house was never the same after that. It got really bizarre at times. It was like we had a lot of poltergeist activity. The cooker would come on, the television would switch on sort of in the middle of the night, and, really blaring. And it didn't matter if you had the plugs in or out, it would still, it's like everything electrical had a mind of its own.
Loud bangs, like someone's crawling over the ceiling, and 3 loud knocks is a very common one that they will hear. It's almost like what the ETs are doing is saying, this is real, take notice of us.
I still, for a long time, believed that they were dreams. They were nothing more than nightmares. My, I suppose, social upbringing would not allow me to consider any other possibility.
But the stories of alien visits were not just confined to Jason. His elder brother Daniel said he too had strange encounters.
My older boy Daniel said, don't you both get it? Don't you see what's going on? Can't you understand it yet? He said, remember when I used to tell you about when I was little, I used to tell you about my soldier guy, that used to come and see me. And we said yes, which we'd always thought was an imaginary friend. And he said, I know now that he was real. He said, I think I've always known he was real. He said he stopped coming to see me because he said that they'd made a mistake and that Jason was the one that they should be working with. We were talking to experts in the UFO field. We were speaking to people about UFO alien abductions.
We don't know enough to make any quantifiable definition of what they are. We have to be open to maybe all possibilities. But there's certainly a tangible interaction, and there's certainly a physical interaction.
Jason always described the same scenario. He will be lying in his bed. He would first of all notice like what he always referred to as the big one would rise up through the floor at the foot of his bed. Then he said there would suddenly be 6 or 8 of the smaller ones. He said that he could see, but he couldn't move. And he would be taken to another place, which when he was younger he described as a hospital place. But he said it was always very cold, extremely cold. He said he described it as like being laid on like a marble slab, something of this kind. He said there was always a light coming from somewhere, but you could never see where it was coming from.
It was now Anne's turn to claim that she too had been abducted by aliens.
She didn't know, I think, that she was an abductee or experiencer to start with. She only thought Jason was. It was only later that she came to an awareness that it affected her and her husband and Dan as well. So that was something for her. But by the time she was corresponding with me and we were talking, it was an everyday part of their lives, something that they'd already come to a certain extent to terms with.
We saw what we thought initially to be a star, very bright star, which we didn't take too much notice of. But then when the star started getting bigger and bigger, and looked as if it was coming straight for our window, we did get quite alarmed. We don't remember any more than that, other than sort of the panic that this thing was coming towards the window. And of course, we woke in the morning just as normal. And then all of a sudden, I remembered. Of course, my first thought was Jason. Where's Jason? Is he okay? I spoke to him and I said to him that, we'd seen this really bright light last night. And he then went on to explain that he'd been taken to a place. It wasn't a usual abduction this time, which he was relieved about. But then he started to say that he was in a room with hundreds of other people and there was like a big cinema screen. And it was just so weird because I finished off his sentence for him. I told him what was on the screen and what was going on and about the other people there. And he just looked at me and smiled and he just said, "Oh, I knew I saw you there, Mum."
Is this proof of aliens abducting a whole family? Or does it show an unexplained psychic bond between a mother and her children?
They'll talk about stuff that would blow your mind. They talk about things that are almost like science fiction, and yet they go into detail. And they have so much depth of knowledge of it, full well this is no fantasy.
People always ask how we deal with this situation. I suppose it's like the realization hits you that there's nothing you can do about this situation.